From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Monday, March 9th, 2015. Missing Microbes, how the overuse of antibiotics is fueling our modern plagues. We'll speak with Dr. Martin Blaser on his acclaimed book. And we'll have a wide-ranging discussion on the politics of solar power with Pamela Burton. She's the founder of Puget Sound Solar. That's coming up today after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Rahul Mahajan. He's a sociologist and news analyst and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. Hi, Rahul.
Hi, Sonali.
Tens of thousands of people gathered over the weekend in Selma, Alabama, exactly 50 years after the Selma March. In March 1965, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led 600 civil rights activists across the Edmund Pettus Bridge when they were brutally beaten by police in an action that led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act. President Obama gave a rousing speech on Saturday where he referenced the Justice Department's recent Ferguson report and said, quote, "Selma teaches us that action requires that we shed our cynicism. For when it comes to the pursuit of justice, we can afford neither complacency nor despair." The theme of Black Lives Matter resonated throughout the march. Attorney General Eric Holder also spoke yesterday, warning of the real legal threats to the Voting Rights Act from conservatives. Republicans were conspicuously absent from the 50th commemorations of the Selma March. Rahul, what do you make of what President Obama said on Saturday and also of the Republican absence?
Well, I mean, I think that the Republican absence says actually something about the Republican Party rather than about mainstream opinion in the United States right now. It says that the Republican Party on the question of civil rights has been trying to detach itself from the mainstream consensus, which has basically retroactively ratified most, if not all, of the actions of the civil rights marchers and, of course, the issue itself. So, you know, I think that here this is a case where the vast majority of people would say, yes, this is a great milestone and this was a great thing. And just the Republican Party mostly demurs largely because of their, you know, lunatic right-wing fringe. It is a shame, however, that even though it's become so mainstreamed, it is not connected to other instances of protest in favor of rights of various kinds. I mean, Obama connects them and says, we're the Selma marchers, we're the people who put the flag on Iwo Jima, we're Jackie Robinson. He never says, you know, we're also Occupy Wall Street.
And we'll be covering the Selma March on tomorrow's edition of Uprising. Activists uniting under the banner of Black Lives Matter have protested for 3 straight days after yet another police shooting of an unarmed black man, this time in Madison, Wisconsin. 19-year-old Tony Robinson Jr. was killed by a white officer named Matt Kenny inside an apartment late last week. Kenny was involved in a fatal shooting once before in 2007. That time, he was exonerated and received a commendation. This time round, he's been placed on administrative leave, while Madison Police Chief Mike Koval is attempting to mollify an angered community and the family members of the victim. Koval has trotted out the familiar claim that the unarmed 19-year-old attacked the armed officer before he was shot to death. Rahul, do you think that we're seeing some semblance of defensive posturing by police because of the relentless activism of the Black Lives Matter movement? That, you know, if it weren't for this movement, a shooting like this might just have been swept under the rug and the officer commended.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important single thing about the Black Lives Matter movement is that it's made essentially every police shooting, especially every police shooting of an unarmed person, and of course, especially a police shooting of an unarmed black person, into a national news event. And as a Madisonian, it's interesting to note the contrast between the sort of, I would characterize it as relatively anemic mobilization over the recent passage of right to work in Wisconsin versus the immediate and fairly powerful mobilization over the killing of Tony Robinson.
And finally, a number of major international foundations, including the Bill, Hillary and Chelsea Clinton Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, have released a report this morning on the status of women and girls around the world. The report, entitled No Ceilings, is an ongoing assessment of the rights of women since a groundbreaking United Nations conference in 1995. While some major markers of women's well-being, such as lifespan, maternal mortality, and access access to education have improved, the report found that many challenges remain. Likely presidential candidate Hillary Clinton has been especially prominent in promoting the report. Rahul, what do you make of this report, and particularly its source, the foundations that put it together?
Well, you know, when a report comes out like this, it's already set up so that no decent person can really criticize it in a generic sense. Of course, you know, it's very hard unless you happen to, in fact, be a Republican politician to say that you're opposed to gender equality or the promotion of the rights of women around the world, but especially in the global South, where they face so many different challenges. So, you know, you can quibble about, for example, the mix of free market and governmental solutions proposed, but basically people have already put themselves on the side of the angels by simply doing a report like this. And, you know, when we talk about the sources of this, I would characterize them differently. With the Clinton Foundation, it's really impossible for me to look at any of the seemingly good programs they do, although it's very hard to know what the actual execution is, without thinking of the contrast between those and what Bill Clinton did in office, most strikingly with the Clinton's health initiative, where, you know, in recent years he has worked on access to the very AIDS drugs that his administration was trying to keep from poor Africans in the late 90s. I mean, that's one where the administration picked a fight with the world over AIDS drugs in order to benefit pharmaceutical companies. Then they lost, and now Clinton has remade himself as a great benefactor of AIDS patients. So, right. You know, and it's also, the Clinton Foundation is business for Bill Clinton. Yes, he raises money for these causes, but he's also raised well over $100 million for himself since he left office.
Well, I want to thank you as always, Rahul, for joining us. We'll talk to you next week.
See you then.
Rahul Mahajan is a sociologist and news analyst, author of Full Spectrum Dominance. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali. You can now watch Uprising on Free Speech TV, which airs on Dish Network Channel 9415, DirecTV Channel 348, and on hundreds of part-time cable affiliates and on Roku. Two major corporations, McDonald's and Costco, have just announced that they will no longer distribute chicken that has been treated with antibiotics. The companies are responding to a growing awareness of the overuse of antibiotics and its links to ill health. Not only are animals in the conventional meat industry routinely treated with drugs to increase yields, doctors have for years overprescribed antibiotics to treat illnesses, many of which don't even benefit from the drugs. Retailers have flooded the market with antibacterial soaps, cleaners, and more, playing to our collective germophobia. To be clear, there are lethal bacteria that can and do kill us and need to be eliminated. But the reality is that for much of human history, we have coexisted with bacteria and have evolved to need germs in our bodies and our environments. Cutting-edge science is increasingly proving that stripping ourselves of bacteria can lead to the rise of antibiotic-resistant superbugs. And it can also make us as individuals develop a host of familiar modern diseases. We turn today to Dr. Martin Blaser. He is the director of the Human Microbiome Program at New York University. He has studied the role of bacteria in human disease for over 30 years. He's the author of the highly reviewed and acclaimed book, Missing Microbes: How the Overuse of Antibiotics is Fueling Our Modern Plagues, which was released last year to wide acclaim and which is just now out in paperback. Welcome to Uprising, Martin Blaser.
My pleasure to be here.
Before we get to the effects or the sort of unintended negative effects of antibiotics, can you explain how important microbes themselves are to our human body? I think many of us still don't appreciate that we are literally crawling inside and outside with millions, billions, trillions of these invisible living creatures. How much of our bodies do they inhabit, and what do they help us do?
Most of the human body is microbial cells. Bacteria, fungi, protozoa, there are also viruses. Those cells outnumber our human cells. And the point is that they are ancient. We have had ever since there have been animals on this planet, which is more than 500 million years, they've had residential organisms calling them home, and we're no different.
Now, so let's talk about let's talk about the antibiotics itself, which when we take, we kill microbes. Sometimes we kill bad microbes or pathogens that can hurt us, but often we end up with a sort of scorched earth approach that where we're killing off too many microbes or the wrong ones. What happens when our microbes get killed? What sort of ill effects can they have on our bodies?
Well, let me just go back a little and say that when a person takes an antibiotic, whether they take it by mouth or intravenously, that antibiotic gets into the bloodstream and it goes to every part of the body. And whenever there are residential microbes, the microbes that call us home, that antibiotic is working. And it's suppressing certain organisms, and it allows other organisms to grow up. So if you have a cut, an infected cut on your hand, that antibiotic is working there, but it's also working throughout your body. And this collateral effect is something that we're very concerned about.
And of course, we should certainly establish, I think, the history, at least for those of us who don't remember or don't know enough about the history of life before antibiotics, right? And I think one of the things that I was quite impressed by your book was that you make it really clear that antibiotics and their advent were a medical revolution that helped save and have helped save millions of lives. Can you give us that brief history of how antibiotics revolutionized medicine?
Most of us attribute the rise of antibiotics to Fleming's discovery of penicillin in 1928. But it wasn't until the 1940s that antibiotics really began to be used. And they began to be used in World War II, and they saved thousands of lives of soldiers who had infected wounds. And it became immediately clear that antibiotics could be life-saving in people who had life-threatening infections. And as a result, they were used to help people go through surgery, to have organ transplantation, chemotherapy. None of those could exist without the umbrella of antibiotics to protect people during those down times and those down cycles. So antibiotics are miraculous drugs. They are the underpinning of medicine. But we doctors have been using them more and more and more. And so it's now considered that some fraction of antibiotics, 60% of antibiotics, in some studies 80% of antibiotics, are unnecessary.
So has this notion in the medical establishment that is thankfully changing today, but this prevalent notion that there's no downside to antibiotics, that we can prescribe them just in case, has that led to the overuse today?
Yeah, very much so. I'm a medical doctor. When I went to school and when 2 or 3 generations of doctors went to school, we learned that antibiotics had a few uncommon toxicities, but mostly they were safe. And that's why they're so wonderful, because you can safely treat so many important infections. But now that we begin to study it, we see that there can be long-term consequences. It was always assumed that you would take an antibiotic, things would be perturbed for a while, and then everything would bounce back to normal. That's what we all thought. The doctors thought it, the public thought it, but it's becoming clear that that's not quite true.
And how much of the blame for the prevalence and overuse of antibiotics can be laid at the feet of pharmaceutical companies that have relied and heavily invested in these so-called broad-spectrum antibiotics? So basically enabling doctors to be able to prescribe drugs that can, just a handful of drugs can have effects on a wide range of maladies. And so instead of having a narrow, focused approach, we're basically killing an ant with a sledgehammer.
Yeah, it's everybody's fault. We can fault the pharmaceutical companies, we can fault the doctors and the dentists and everybody who's using antibiotics. We can fault the public because everybody thought it was free. But in essence, it's kind of nobody's fault. This kind of ran away from us because we thought it was free. If something's free, you want to use it. And if I'm a doctor and I think there's not going to be any problem and that a patient could potentially benefit from it, then I'll say, why not? Because it's free. But once we begin to understand that it's not free, now we have to recalculate things. Right. And the pharmaceutical companies were developing broad-spectrum antibiotics because that's what we want. When a patient comes in with pneumonia, we don't know what they have, so we treat them with a broad-spectrum antibiotic, which will cover most of the bases. But even now, we can start to narrow it down. And one of the things I call for in Missing Microbes is that we have to develop a whole new generation of antibiotics, narrow-spectrum antibiotics, that will just target the agent causing the infection and not cause all this collateral damage.
And also have much faster turnaround time for the tests that doctors do, right? Because how can they determine what drugs, specific drugs to give us, unless they can get the results of testing of our bodily fluids within hours?
Right. So we need those rapid diagnostic tests. Now, it turns out that a lot of tests exist right now, but the whole economics of the visit to the doctor for antibiotics is just all wrong. We're relying on relatively inexpensive antibiotics, but ultimately the cost to us is much, much greater because of the damage they're doing, especially to our children.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought up children. That was my next question. You make the case in your book that an increasing over-reliance on C-sections in childbirth has had a serious impact on the microbiomes of babies. And this was something that I just didn't really realize, that in women's bodies, most of our bodies have microbes, but our wombs are essentially sterile. We don't have microbes in our wombs. And when babies are born, they're colonized in the first moments of their life by microbes from the mother. But generally, they're colonized when there's vaginal deliveries. When there's C-section, what happens to babies?
Well, as you said, in the womb, the baby is sterile or almost sterile. And then when the water breaks, that's where they have their first introduction to the world of bacteria. And when they pass out through the birth canal, they're covered with their mom's bacteria. We humans are mammals, and this is how mammals have been doing it for 100 million years. But C-sections, those babies don't get that initial exposure. Now, there are very important reasons to do C-sections. It's like antibiotics. There are important reasons when it's life-saving, but the rates of C-section have gone up and up and up. So today, 1/3 of all babies born in the United States are born by C-section. And in some countries, it's half the babies are born by C-section. They're all missing that normal initial inoculum.
And it's the first 3 years of a baby's life that they acquire the majority of microbes that then they live with for the rest of their lives. So what impact can that have on children? And what are some of the diseases that you, through your experiments in your lab and your colleagues, through your experiments on mice, think might be linked to missing microbes in the first 3 years of babies' lives?
Well, you stated it really quite well. So during those 3 years when the microbiome is developing, that's when babies are developing. They're developing their immunity, their metabolism, their cognition, their brain function. And so if they're developing their microbiome aberrantly or incorrectly because of C-sections and antibiotics and formula feeding and many other factors that are all cumulative, then there's the theoretical possibility that it's affecting their metabolic development, that it may make them more prone to obesity and diabetes, and their immunologic development more prone to asthma and allergies. And we and others have been finding evidence that this is correct, and that this, in fact, is a factor that was unrecognized before, but which is fueling these epidemics of these modern plagues.
It's amazing. You know, when I had my children in the hospital, one of the first things that they do to babies when they're born is that they give them a vitamin K shot, and vitamin K is an interesting thing that's produced, I understand, by bacteria in our body. But they also smear their eyes with erythromycin, an antibiotic, just in case they might get infected with gonorrhea, whether or not the mother has gonorrhea. I mean, So we do this to babies within the first few minutes of their lives?
Yeah, so again, everybody thinks there's no cost to that. So each of the 4 million babies born in the United States is getting those antibiotics in their eye drops. The eye disease due to gonorrhea in babies was a terrible disease before there was antibiotics. Now it can be treated, and the number of potential cases is probably low. It's in the hundreds, but we're treating the millions. In many countries in Europe, they don't treat babies with antibiotics, and they seem to be doing fine. There's no epidemic of child blindness. So again, we're using it thinking that it's free. But I think that all these things are cumulative.
So when babies, through their first years of their lives, establish their microbiome, their colonies of bacteria, how does that develop differently in babies in the Western world versus in the non-industrialized world? The science has shown that there are different species and different varieties of microbes in countries where, for example, mothers pre-chew their foods as opposed to feeding jar food, or where the water supplies aren't as chlorinated as they are here.
Yeah, so, if we compare the United States, a very industrialized, developed country for more than 100 years, with some countries in Africa or Latin America, there are huge differences. There are many different kinds of differences. You've named a few of them, but there are even more. But what we can say is that their microbes are different, substantially different. And the point that I want to discuss the most is that their microbes are more diverse than ours. And we ecologists think that diversity is very important for health. And there's increasing evidence that we in the United States and other developed countries are losing diversity. And that can have important consequences for health. That's still theoretical, but there is more and more information that we have lost diversity. And now the question is, does that have a direct consequence or not?
Let's talk about the use of antibiotics in livestock. I used to think that factory farms administered antibiotics because of the horrible crowded conditions that they raised animals in to just fend off disease. But through reading your book, I realized that they just administer them continuously at low levels because antibiotics just basically cause animals to gain weight. So there's a profit incentive. Whether or not we understand clearly why that happens, the agribusinesses know that it happens, and so they're putting these in at least conventional foods. And does that then get passed on to us? And if so, wouldn't it have the same effect in our bodies as it does in animals' bodies?
Well, your points are all good. Farmers and agricultural scientists have known for 70 years that if they put low doses of antibiotics into the food or water of livestock, they will gain weight faster. It's what they call growth promotion. And the reason that they do it is because it works. And as a result, 70 to 80% of all the antibiotics used in the United States are used on the farm specifically for growth promotion. It is not used to treat disease because they're not even using therapeutic doses. They're using sub-therapeutic doses. Now, some of that antibiotic gets into our foods. There have been surveys in the supermarket that some meats have residuals of the antibiotics. Milk may have antibiotic, and in some communities, their drinking water has antibiotics. Now, the levels are low, but millions of people are being exposed, and no one has ever studied what the consequences are. We don't know what they are, but we need to know.
And the FDA has just a couple of years ago finally come out and said this is a serious problem. They need to do something about it. But in Europe, it's been banned for years. Is there? Do you have a good sense that the FDA is going to start to ban these? Because we're probably, animals are probably losing microbes as well, and overall ecologically that can have an impact.
This is one of the reasons I wrote Missing Microbes, to inform the public about all these issues, because it will take political muscle to change these. The farmers are very much interested in this because it increases their profit margin. But I was pleased to see that last week McDonald's said they're phasing out chickens raised with antibiotics. And a few years ago, Tyson Farms said that they were going to do it. And so it's coming along. The FDA's is taking baby steps. I hope they are steps in the right direction because we need to do it. We are squandering our legacy of antibiotics, including the development of resistance on the farm, to save a few pennies on meat, plus the fact that the antibiotics are coming over to us because not all the farmers are ethical. They're still keeping them on antibiotics. There's supposed to be a washout period before they go to market, and obviously that's being violated at some times.
There was just a report on milk and residual antibiotics being found in milk, and in fact some farmers giving antibiotics that are not tested for to slip them in. Let's turn to you mentioned resistance, and that's one of the huge concerns for our modern society. We've seen the rise of these deadly pathogens that don't respond to antibiotics. MRSA is one, MRSA, known by its acronym. Recently there was an outbreak at UCLA Medical Center of a superbug. Can you explain for our audience how it works? How does the overuse of antibiotics actually give rise to bacteria that don't respond to antibiotics?
Well, what antibiotics do is that they suppress or kill bacteria. That's what they're chemicals that do this, and they don't differentiate between whether the bacteria are good or bad. They're just whether they're susceptible or not. So if you take antibiotics, they will kill the susceptible ones, and that allows resistant ones to rise up. And of course, we're doing this on an enormous scale on the farm. And so resistant organisms are rising up on the farm, and they're coming to over to humans via food. Now, it's also happening in the hospitals because of our use of antibiotics. So the more we use antibiotics, the more we promote resistance. There are very important times to use antibiotics. I want to be very clear about that. Mm-hmm. There are times when antibiotics are life-saving, and the issue of resistance doesn't come into, it's a trivial. But because of the overuse of antibiotics, that's also fueling resistance. So one of the best ways to get this resistance problem under control is to minimize antibiotic use, save it for the times we really need to. Now, this is a decision of doctors, because in the United States, you need a prescription to get antibiotics. But sometimes patients lean on the doctors, and they feel disappointed if the doctor doesn't give them an antibiotic. And as I say in Missing Microbes, if the doctor has done a careful exam and says you or your child doesn't need an antibiotic, you should be happy that you don't have a serious infection, not feel that you need the antibiotic, because the antibiotic has cost. And if it's not going to have any benefit, you don't need it.
So, Dr. Blaser, let's talk a little bit about the complexity and how we're just understanding how microbes function in our body. A lot of your research has focused on a particular microbe called H. pylori, which scientists had years ago linked to ulcers, and which became this universally reviled microbe. And you describe in your book, essentially, the only good H. pylori microbe is a dead one, which has been the sort of approach. But your work has revealed that under some circumstances, H. pylori is necessary for us, and in other circumstances it can cause things like ulcers and cancers. How does that fit within the context of what we know about microbiology today, and how microbes work in concert with one another?
Yeah, I think H. pylori is kind of a poster child, initially discovered as a pathogen, and it's a serious pathogen causing ulcers and causing stomach cancer, which is worldwide the #2 cause of cancer death. I was very much involved in those studies. Yeah. And those are problems that mostly occur late in life. And I began to think, Helicobacter pylori has been present in humans for at least 200,000 years, probably for millions of years. And perhaps it has some benefits. And once we started looking for it, we found the benefits. You know that there's an epidemic all over the Western world of reflux esophagitis, or what's called GERD, or reflux, or heartburn. That's been going up dramatically in recent decades, just when Helicobacter seems to be disappearing. And we and others, there are more than 50 papers now showing evidence that Helicobacter protects the esophagus. So we can say that Helicobacter is bad for your stomach, but it's good for your esophagus. And we and others have done studies to show that Helicobacter may be good for your lungs. Kids without Helicobacter are more likely to develop asthma. And studies in mice have confirmed this. So we're seeing a complex biological relationship with this organism that calls us home. Good for our esophagus and our lungs, bad for our stomach. 15 years ago, I suggested that we should be giving our kids H. pylori, and then at a certain age, get rid of it with antibiotics. And then we could optimize health. That's going to take a long time to turn that wheel around, and maybe we'll find better substitutes. But that could be an approach.
Well, let's talk about some of the cutting-edge research that's being done on how we can start to deal with the ill effects of antibiotics. You write in your book about the discovery some years ago of an indigenous community in Venezuela that had really had very little contact with the outside world, and they were kind enough to share their specimens with scientists who found an incredible diversity of microbes. And as we were talking about in non-industrialized countries, there's just a greater diversity compared to those of us in the Western world. What have we lost and can it be replaced? What have we lost in terms of our microbial diversity? And can we see what isolated communities have that we don't have, maybe use that to replace what we've lost.
Well, you've read the book so carefully. I
have to say, I couldn't stop reading it. I started reading it on Friday, and I couldn't stop reading it till yesterday, so it's fascinating.
Well, thank you very much. Actually, I'm very pleased to say that the study in Venezuela has just been accepted for publication. It's going to be in a journal called Science Advances. I think it's going to come out this month or next month. The study was led by Maria Gloria Dominguez Bello, who happens to be my wife, as I point out in the book. And as you say, it shows that this group of people who have not been contacted by Westerners before, so they're living basically a Stone Age existence. They have so much more diversity in their skin, in their gut than we do. It implies that we have lost a lot. It also implies that people like that may be a reservoir for those lost strains. We may not be able to find them in the US, but we can find them in these other places. And maybe that's going to be the source of those future strains that we're going to give to children to replace the ones that they've lost as a result of modernization.
Let's also talk about some of the things that we can do personally in our day-to-day lives to stop this over-reliance on things that kill off bacteria, in addition to doctors slowly changing their approaches and maybe mothers to be trying to avoid elective C-sections. What about the substances that we find in our cleaning products? I mean, dishwashing liquid says it has antibacterial that kills 99% of all germs. People are constantly rubbing these hand sanitizers on their hands. You go to the supermarket and now they give you wipes with antibacterial stuff on them, and I've watched people wiping their carts lest they be infected by the germs of the previous person who held the cart. Are those also detrimental? Do those also rid us of our good bacteria?
Well, it's never been exactly studied, but my fear is that they're doing us more harm than they're doing us good, because when you apply these, they're killing bacteria, including your own good bacteria, and the good bacteria help protect us against the bad bacteria. So you ask practical things. There are studies that show that taking antibiotics during pregnancy increases risk for certain diseases in the baby later. So antibiotics should only be used when necessary. C-section should be done only when necessary. Babies should be fed by the breast and not be fed formula unless it's impossible to do that, because the formula just superficially resembles breast milk. Breast milk is full of compounds designed for healthy bacteria. So breast milk in, formula out. Kids should only get antibiotics when they absolutely need them. In countries in Europe, there's huge variation in how often kids get antibiotics. And in studies here in the United States, we see that variation. So we have to decrease all these kinds of exposures. It turns out that a lot of foods have antibacterials in the foods. They were put in the foods to increase the shelf life of the foods, to protect them against bacteria. But these antibacterials, we're taking them in. We don't know the full effect of those. There was just a paper published about some of the emulsifiers used in foods that have antibacterial effects.
These are processed foods in particular.
Yeah. So our microbiota is under onslaught, and therefore it's no surprise that our diversity has gone down. But so we have to be aware of all of these, and we have to understand what are the consequences. Are there times when it's absolutely necessary? Are there times when we should do alternative things?
And actually, there's this one sort of growing trend among parents in the Western world who are concerned about this. And I'm wondering if you can set the record straight. I mean, people think that maybe if they let their kids eat dirt or play more in the dirt and not wash their hands as much, that'll help restore their microbiology. Is that true?
Well, there are many people who think it's true. I think it's irrelevant. Okay. Because the microbes in dirt are evolved for soil. They're not evolved for human beings. And when you take them in, they won't last in your system very long. The home bacteria will throw them out. What is important are the microbes that we humans have had for millennia, for hundreds of thousands of years, that we're losing. those are the most important ones. We have to figure out how to stop the damage and how to start replacing them.
Well, finally, Dr. Blaser, I know this may sound utterly revolting to our audience, but I have to ask you, there have been a lot of, and you write about this in your book, there have been a lot of promising experiments showing that fecal transplants between people who have a healthy gut bacteria and those who don't has actually found to have excellent results. And of course, there's a serious ick factor here. There's even some instances of do-it-yourself at home anecdotes, which I'm sure you're not advising people. But can you tell us if this is a promising avenue of gross but possibly effective treatment for a host of problems?
Yeah, well, there's a very serious infection due to a bacterium. It's called Clostridium difficile infection, or C. diff. It's an infection that often comes about in people who've had antibiotics, and it can be a very severe disease. In fact, thousands of people die from it every year in the United States. Very bad disease, and it's been found that taking a fecal transplant, a fecal specimen from a healthy person, basically cures these people. There was a controlled clinical trial in the Netherlands a few years ago. They had to stop the trial because the fecal transplant works so much better than the conventional therapy. And that's become really one of the leading therapies for that particular infection. Now, there are lots of people who are trying to extrapolate from that and say, well, if it's good for that, it's good for something else. But none of those have been tested. Right. And I do not recommend it except in the context of a clinical trial. Then we will discover for what ailments will it work and for which ones will it not work, and expose people to unnecessary risk.
And finally, do you have an opinion on the probiotic supplements that are all over the health food shelves, but also the increased resurgence in fermented foods?
Well, I love yogurt. I eat yogurt every day. I have for decades, but I eat it because it's delicious. And I vaguely think it's healthy for me, but and that's plain yogurt. In terms of probiotics, you go to the health food store, the grocery store, the pharmacy. There are hundreds of products. They're all labeled probiotic. What I can say is that they are generally, but not completely safe, and they are almost entirely untested. So I don't know what they do. Yeah. In fact, nobody knows what they do. And the people who sell them make lots of extravagant claims, and there are many people who buy them. That's why there are so many of these products. But they also need to be tested so we can understand which are the ones that work and which are the ones that don't.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and spending the time to explain this very important issue to us. Thank you so much.
And thank you for your careful reading of Missing Microbes.
Thank you. Dr. Martin Blaser has been my guest. He's director of the Human Microbiome Program at New York University. He studied the role of bacteria in human disease for over 30 years. He's the author of the highly reviewed and acclaimed book that we've been discussing, Missing Microbes, How the Overuse of Antibiotics is Fueling Our Modern Plagues. It was just released last year to wide acclaim and out last month in paperback. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. You can now subscribe for direct access to all our shows online at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Your subscription sustains the TV production of Uprising. The latest oil train incident in Illinois near the Mississippi River has reminded us of the ongoing dangers of fossil fuels. Not only does the extraction of fossil fuels pollute our immediate environment, the transportation is dangerous and prone to accidents. And of course, the consumption of dirty energy pollutes our air and warms our atmosphere, risking the future of the human species. The frustrating aspect of examining the destructive nature of coal, oil, and gas is that there are so many alternatives out there that we just aren't utilizing to their fullest extent. Today, Today we'll examine an industry that has so much promise for cutting down our fossil fuel consumption that it has the Koch brothers running scared. I'm speaking, of course, about solar energy. The good news is that solar panels are cheaper now than ever before, and they're more efficient than ever. And there are ways to switch to solar even if you don't own a home or live in a sunny area. Joining me in studio to discuss how much more viable solar is today and to dispel some myths about the industry is Pamela Burton. She's a founder and CFO of Puget Sound Solar, based in the state of Washington. She served as president of Solar Washington, and in a past life, she was the director of the Pacifica Radio Archive, so she's a history with KPFK where our program is produced. Welcome to the show, Pamela.
Thank you so much. So great to be here.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, before we get to the threats to solar, tell us about why it is actually a really great time to be in the solar industry today. There are tons of solar startups, but you've actually been in this industry for quite a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've been at it for 14 years, and the table has now really been set for having a fabulous meal.
Okay.
We have incentives available, and I want to talk nationwide, of course. Many states are facing the challenges of global climate change within their boundaries. The utilities are looking at what it's going to mean for them to be able to produce additional electricity to meet the new needs of computer. Of course, the whole computerized world is growing, and electric cars are important to think about the electricity. Where are we going to get that? So it's a race to get it taken care of, and it's really quite exciting. I go to these solar conferences, international solar conferences. I hear about what's going on in the Middle East, where they are hell-bent on going to solar. They're not going to spend. They're not going to, sell all their oil, use all their own oil. Or places like Jordan, where they've been highly dependent on something like propane, which is incredibly expensive. They're going to solar full on. So of course the Chinese now are producing solar with the opening of their dams. They have a lot less expensive electricity available, so now they can get into it. They can be making the solar-grade silicon, which is, of course, a mainstay of the solar panels, how you make solar panels. So since they've gotten into it, the price has dropped amazingly. And that's something I have to tell people all the time, including the utilities. Many of the utilities are not aware of that. We're educating them to let them know that solar is less and less expensive.
I'm glad you brought that up. The Washington Post just this morning had an article about how utility companies basically just don't like solar, especially rooftop solar, which they are fighting tooth and nail. Explain why. Why would they feel like it's not in their interest?
Well, it varies tremendously, utility to utility. In Seattle, I have a very smart utility. The whole state is in fact even the there's the nonprofit utilities, that what they call the PUDs, the public utilities, and then there's the private utilities, and everybody's on board in Washington State. California is very similar, but there are issues for the utilities. One of the things is realizing that at my house I'm making 4 times the electricity I need during the summer. So I am running my neighbor's house with the excess. The electrons literally go down the line and to my neighbor's house. And in that way, I am using the line, but I'm not needing to buy any electricity.
And your neighbor isn't either.
Well,
technically,
they're paying as they normally would. But the idea would be that then I get a credit that I get to use, but I'm using the grid as my battery. So the utilities do want us to pay for a certain amount of service. In other words, that I'm still using the grid. So part of what they have to come to grips with, okay, how much is this what is it really going to cost us? And there's so many discussions going on about how to figure out the cost. So that's
in
one
some
way.
places, utilities are charging prohibitively high fees that makes you sort of wonder and suspicious.
Yeah,
but,
if you have a utility that's backed by coal, you have there are major challenges to get that utility to go solar.
But it's amazing how big the solar industry is today. I was reading that there are now twice as many people employed by the solar industry nationally than coal.
Yeah.
That's huge.
Yeah. Obama's plan, the whole federal grant program that brought in more money for us to do in Washington State. We were doing energy efficiency, which is really, really important, along with doing solar. So there was utilities picked up on this. They got extra money. They helped us build our company. So I went from 15 employees to 32.
Wow. So let's talk about some of the misconceptions that are out there about solar, particularly among people who, love the idea of solar, but have been told, well, you either have to have $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 outright to buy your own, or you have to get into a lease where there's a lot of controversy around leasing. If you sell your home, assuming you're a homeowner to begin with, you may not be able to transfer the lease easily. And of course, if you're an apartment dweller, which many of us are, that's just not even accessible. How do you help people navigate who are, theoretically, their hearts are with solar?
So we've been working on this. My husband spends a lot of time lobbying in the state capitol in Olympia. And there are a lot of, again, the table is set. There's all kinds of choices. For some people, leases make a really good choice. But if an elder comes to me and says they'd like to do solar on a home, but they're going to move in 5 years, so they figure it's not worth investing in a system. Well, it's not going to be good to do a lease, because your leases are 20 to 30 years. So you have to be prepared to take 20, 30 lease. It is a good idea to invest if you have the money and you need the federal tax credit, which is 30% of the cost of the system. Do that now, and your house is going to be worth more when you sell. The lease will not add value to your house.
So basically, if you can't afford to put solar panels on and buy them outright, it's like adding a new fireplace. It adds to, enhances the house. Yeah.
And now the loan industry has widened so tremendously since the downturn in the economy. So there are fabulous loans out there that you can get. In Washington State, we have a credit union. And then when all the people went from banks to credit unions, they exploded our credit unions. And this one credit union came to me and said, what can we do? We need to give loans. We only loan money for energy efficiency and electric cars. Will you do solar? Would you want to do Yes. So we have, like, immediately my customers doubled once I was able to give them a reasonable loan, and it's not against your house, it's against the system. And the fabulous thing is, people that take out loans as people that take out leases, you have to have a good credit score. Right. But you are a fabulous investment. I've heard from my the loan agency that I work with, Puget Sound Cooperative Credit Union, nobody's ever defaulted on a loan.
Right. Yet some Republicans have warned that the solar leasing market is, these loan markets are creating a bubble like the subprime mortgage market. And of course, when people hear that, it freaks them out. Is that true?
It is this. It could be the same problem that you had with if they're now securitizing the loans and they're selling them in big packets on Wall Street, and that can always be a problem. Like I said, I have the feeling that most people that invest in solar, because you have to have that good credit score up front, you're probably not gonna. It's not gonna be like when they sold houses to people that really couldn't afford it.
So what about people who live in apartments? I was reading that there are now companies that are starting to allow apartment renters to buy or lease a set of solar panels somewhere way out in a solar farm. I mean, that's incredible.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be on your own rooftop.
Yeah, and my favorite is the community solar projects we're doing in Washington State, where we just put up a big array on the Woodland Park Zoo on the cafeteria. We did one on the people's cafeteria, and we also did one on the animals cafeteria. And those are sold through the utility, our public utility. You as a renter can go and buy a share, and you will get what is our production incentive, which is 54 cents for every kilowatt hour when we put up Made in Washington panels. So it's a huge reward, and you, the renter, will earn that. So you invest in and help them pay for that solar roof in the community, on a community building, a school, a library, a park, and then you'll get the reward. And you'll also get credit for the electricity that's made, so that'll get written off against your bill.
Wow. So now there are also, in addition to these individual abilities to, get solar, there are, in California, there are these two huge solar plants that opened up recently. One is Ivanpah, it's called, in the Mojave Desert, that can power 140,000 homes. That was the biggest solar plant in the world. And then a new one just opened up near Joshua Tree called Desert Sunlight that can power 160,000 homes. It's the new biggest plant in the world. They've both received massive subsidies from the Obama government. How important are such subsidies?
Well, initially in the beginning, that's always important as far as building an industry. And if we want to, and in those cases, I'm pretty sure they had to be made in America panels. So you're investing
in... It's an economic stimulus.
Yeah. and you're buying a huge amount of products. So you really encourage the industry to build, and it's the way that we're going to grow this so that we can produce the amount of solar panels that we need, which at times there have been shortages because, again, it's a new industry and we want to build as fast as we can.
Now, Republicans get very upset about these subsidies, but they tend to not mention that oil companies also get massive subsidies in the form of tax breaks.
Yeah, subsidies are kind of like taxes. They're not really realistic about what it means. And they are important. And again, in Washington State, I have to brag, and I know that nationwide that everybody's going to have a different mix in their states, and I want to encourage them to look at aces.org for one of the places that they can go to and find out. The American Solar Energy Society is the nonprofit. They've got chapters in most states. People can look up their own states. They can go to Desire, D-S-I-R-E, to look up their own states to find out what their rewards are. But in the case of Washington State, we have both sides of the aisle coming together. And this has been going on. So right now we're in Olympia to renew our production incentive or to look at how the one has worked so far, which has been in effect for over 10 years, and what should we do next. We sit at the table with the utilities, both sides of the aisle, and the consumers are there, and and the solar companies are there, and the manufacturers are there, and everybody's sitting around having these fabulous discussions. The leasing companies have been there too, and we're having the discussion about how to move forward and how all working together, because this is a big puzzle and we got a lot of pieces to put together. But we're lucky, and although I got to say, there's a lot of Republicans that are starting to really understand, because if you've been frozen out and you're in an area in the South right now, which normally doesn't get freezing temperatures, you're waking up every morning to the reality of global climate change.
A lot of rank-and-file conservatives are understanding the reality of climate change and see solar as an independence issue, right? That you get energy independence.
That's what we've said. We're off the Middle East. We want to get off of that oil drip. We've been addicted for too long to oil. So solar is really a fabulous solution.
I mentioned the Koch brothers, and of course it seems like every time there's a constructive, progressive, beneficial idea that's going to make the planet better and benefit ordinary people, it would make sense that the Koch brothers would be against it. What are they doing?
Well, once they start investing in solar, of course, this is all going to turn around. And God knows, with toilet paper and every other product the Koch brothers are invested in. But, that is a hard one for them because they're so heavily invested in tar sands, and they don't like the idea that we would be replacing that.
And how are they fighting solar? I mean, how can we tell what might be a sort of Koch brothers-funded piece of propaganda against solar?
Well, again, the Desire website tells us which states have come up with the renewable portfolio standards, which we call an RPS. And in our state, we did it with a citizens initiative, and we told our utilities by X year you have to be buying X amount of renewable energy. And we've dictated that. And there are at least, I think, probably 30 states at this point that have RPSs, and many legislatures passed them. In some cases, Colorado, Washington State, we had a citizens initiative. But in those cases, you do have places where it gets set, or the net metering laws get set, and the net metering law says you are going to produce, when you produce electricity at your house and you put it back into the grid, you get a credit for that, like I do in Seattle. And those laws that have been written, the Koch brothers go in and lobby to change them.
Right.
North Carolina was the worst example. And it's like the voter laws, where they go in the middle of the night, they get their chosen people to make some, crazy, way of screwing with the legislative process and then taking away what the people have worked so hard to legislate.
How promising is the solar industry as a source of decent paying jobs? I understand that you don't necessarily need an expensive degree to be qualified, and you can actually make a halfway decent living.
Yeah. And I get calls all the time from these fabulous graduates with environmental degrees from the University of Washington. They want to do solar. And I say, how comfortable are you working on a roof? That's a big part of the industry. People that currently are comfortable working on roofs. So I love getting roofers. I love getting soldiers who say, day. I say, how come you were on a roof? Well, fine if nobody's shooting at me, you know. And working on a roof, working with power tools. So a lot of these young people who have worked with Dad and doing basic construction,
so good blue-collar jobs.
That's a really good way in, and you know, with the base fee being at least $18 an hour, and I give
$18 an hour.
I give medical benefits and dental and the whole bit.
Now,
so that's a big part. Now the college part is a lot of the design and the layout and knowing how to do a CAD program, and thank goodness I've got fabulous positions for women in my office doing design work, SketchUp. I've got
women can work
engineer.
on roofs, though, too, I'm sure.
Women can work on roofs. So the one physical drawback, and this is true for men too, is you basically have to be able to carry 30 pounds of glass up a ladder.
Yeah.
So that.
So one of the things that some people are concerned by is the pollution and waste from solar panels. What happens to solar panels when their lifetime is over? And aren't they made with polluting materials, heavy toxic metals, etc.?
This traditional panel is silicon, sand, glass, aluminum, small amounts of particles. Everything gets encased.
Okay.
Everything, when you look at these factories and the way they make the solar grade silicon, all the waste products all get circulated in the factory. The energy gets circulated. Everything is reused. And the new ones are talking about cadmium. That is all going to be cadmium taken out of tailings and leftovers from cadmium mining, I guess, is what it was. What
are solar panels recycled?
And the solar panels themselves can be completely recycled. And the solar panels that I know have made at the Bell Labs that I've seen on display are over 60 years old, and they're still producing electricity. So the other thing is they have a really long life.
Well, finally, Pamela, how much has the Obama presidency contributed to the viability of solar? People say there's no difference between Democrats and Republicans, and in many places there aren't, but somewhere in the margins there are serious differences. And Bush and Obama had vastly different attitudes towards solar, and my fear is that if we get a new Republican president, how much progress that has been made just in the past handful of years could be undone.
Yeah, and my best answer to that is the fact that when the Republicans fought the extension on the federal tax credit for 18 times, they voted it down under Bush. And as soon as Obama got elected, they just rolled over, and Maria Cantwell, God bless her, and the solar industries were at the table saying, well, we don't want a $2,000 tax credit. We want 30% of the cost of the system. So they exploded that tax credit. They made it totally viable, but also just it was kind of a magic bullet at that point for the industry, because a lot of people, so many people need tax write-offs. This is a tax credit, so you'll actually be able to take that. So if it's a $30,000 system, you get $10,000 back. So it's really, really important, and that's what happened. And following from that, everything that he has said and done, other than when he talks about something like clean coal.
Yeah, as if such a thing exists.
It's been very productive, and I think he's got it. I think he understands. The whole cylinder thing is absolutely fascinating when you look at the whole backstory and the fact that the Republicans used that to downgrade.
Yeah, this was one company of many that went bankrupt while many others didn't.
With a perfectly productive product at the time when solar grade silicon was at a shortage. It made total sense. And our biggest system in Seattle is on the stadium at Safeco.
We're out of time.
And it's Cylindra.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Pamela, thank you so much for joining us
welcome.
today. My guest, Pamela Burton, is founder and CFO of Puget Sound Solar, based in the state of Washington. And once upon a time, she was the director of the Pacifica Radio Archives. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Christian Beck is our production assistant. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. And Federico Garcia is our audio engineer. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Darren White and Michael Casey are our interns. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you tomorrow.